Okay, we're going to start in a few minutes.
Are you chasing out your cat?
Okay, so I understand we're recording, and I'm just looking to see if we have two of our presenters. Are we okay with waiting a few more minutes, or should we get started right away? I would like, if it's okay with other presenters, just to give a few more minutes in case I think we have two other um, presenters scheduled for this session, and in case they're just a few minutes late getting here. I know we have sort of dead air on our recording, but I think just to minimize disruption, maybe we'll just give them a few minutes in case they're having technical difficulties or something. And so maybe once we get started, we'll turn, if we're not presenting, we'll turn our cameras and our mics off, just so we can focus on the presenter. And I think we all have the ability now to share our screens, um, thanks to Uju. Um, so you can do that when you're ready to go. Um, okay, I think we will get started. And I will just begin by doing just letting you know what the title of the session and the title of the presentations and the presenters, and then I will ask each presenter to also tell us a little bit more about themselves and to introduce themselves. So the title of this session is Utopias Yet Realities, Refugee Paths and Stories. And we will begin with a presentation by Nasreen Chowdhory, and she will be presenting Interrogating Camp Space in Forced Migration Studies. And then I think, oh, this looks like maybe is your co-presenter with you today, Nasreen?
No, I'm afraid she's not actually.
Okay, so but on Shamna, um, I'm really not going to pronounce this correctly. Can you pronounce her name for me, Nasreen?
Sure. It's Shamna Thacham Poyil.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So she's also on this paper, and then we will have Nicolas Parent from McGill University, and he will be presenting mutual aid amongst refugees, organized abandonment, and anarchic places. So I think we'll be ready. We're ready to go now, and maybe I'll just say that if I can, what I will do for timing, and I think we could go 20 minutes for each presentation. And at 15 minutes, I'll give you a raised hand. And then just a sort of a 1 minute warning to wrap up. I'll give you a thumbs up. How's that? And then I don't know what I'll do after that. I suppose if you go beyond, I'll give you another thumbs up. But honestly, we have lots of time, so that's not to worry. So okay, so then I'll pass it over to just thank Uju for being here today as well, our support technical person, and pass it over to you, Nasreen.
All right. Well, it's good evening from here, and I believe it's good morning there. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for putting in a panel, which is very interesting. My co-author will be joining. She just messaged me, but she's not keeping well, so she will join, but she won't be presenting. So I will be presenting the paper. I teach in Delhi University, located in Delhi, India. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Well, I work on forced migration, mostly related to camps now. And some of the work's already there, so I'm not going to, but one of the work that I'm very excited that's coming out is gender identity in migration in India with Calvert. So I'm hoping we'll be able to give a sense of not only the South Asian context of migration, but more specifically in the context of India. All right, so without much ado, let me just begin my presentation. What we intend to do on this paper is to give you a sense of camp as a place of exception or not in the post-migration studies. So I'm going to just do is a bit of a reading from the paper. The conceptualization of refugee camps in the academia has largely been Eurocentric in the beginning as a response to the specific conditions created in the continent in the wake of two world wars. Even though the current literature emphasizes the refugee camps that exist in the global south, such as those in Africa and others, there is a still considerable dearth of work on the specific context and circumstances of camps in South Asia. The colonial legacy, along with the post-colonial state-building attempt in most of these countries, has not created. Let me just continue with the sentence. The colonial legacy, along with the post-colonial state-building attempts in most of these countries, has not created a seamless affiliation between the people and the borders. The shadow of partition and the migration across the border of India and Pakistan in 47 and later in 71 during the creation of Bangladesh proves the incoherent and rather ruptured affiliation between the people and the borders in South Asia. The state building project in majority of the post-colonial countries of Global South has often precipitated to carving a mono-ethnic or homogeneous nation based on vested sectarian interests, as has been in the case of Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Apart from creating the causal condition for generating masses of refugees and stateless people across the region, such attempts also complicate the attitude of host communities in an already resource-starved countries of Global South towards providing protection to the vulnerable refugees who cross over to the borders. They need to inhibit the movement of people crossing the borders, which has been furthered and enacted by corresponding political response of containing this population within the confines of a camp, such as those of refugee camps, evolved into a de facto durable solution to the problem of unchecked forced migration. Camp can be seen as a temporary spatial construct conditioned by the uncertainty of exclusion and protection both at once. The prevalent method of sheltering the forced migration have led to a larger observation that accommodation practices of refugees in Global South is hyphenated with refugee camps, whereas those of Global North are along the lines of asylum center. With accommodation of refugees being eventually institutionalized through various asylum laws in many of the countries of Europe, terminologies such as asylum reception, accommodation center, asylum shelter, and homes took a center stage. The prevalence of refugee camps in Global South makes it imperative to understand the socio-political and cultural milieu of the countries that host a sizable population of refugees so as to assess the significance of camps in the context of their ad hoc refugee treatment process. Now, I'm not going to engage too much with the history, but just to give you a context, we had intended to have an historical context and then move into the idea of humanitarian speciality of camps and then talk about the exceptionality of South Asia. Now, rather than attempting to provide a comprehensive definition, what we intend to do is attempt to make an historical and epistemological analysis of camp itself. The need for historiography is to locate and to put in perspective the need for a nuanced and detailed post-colonial introspection of refugee camps in South Asia. It is also to reaffirm that toward the subcontinent where practices of hospitality has existed from time immemorial, providing protection to people by casting them to makeshift structures of camp is a colonial administrator endowment. Kanochi and others have started to build on a genealogy of camps from the late 18th century, whereby locating prisoner of war of 1790s and internment camps as camps of containment. Starting from the French Revolution, wars followed by the Napoleonic, as well as American Civil and later World War I and II, she elaborates on how prisoners of war or, wherein the camps became the common aspect to house the soldiers and enemies. Now, these are retrospectively can be suggested that it serves as a precursor to understand how the concentration camps also became so much important in the context of the Nazi regime. Now, I don't want to dwell too much into the historical aspect, but to give you a very slim understanding is the seed of spatial segregation was laid by various empires in order to promote certain kind of administrative structure towards material condition, which was necessary to forcefully intern them or allow people to live in certain restricted areas, which were called colonies, right? So in other words, we can say that the various emergence of camp or the understanding of camp has a very colonial understanding. So what we attempted to do is to give you a post-colonial understanding, trying to locate how does the historical context, which is critical, it matters. But what also matters is to give you a sense of the post-colonial or the South Asian context. For South Asia, the history of refugee camp is intertwined with the account of forced migration across borders at the instance of mutation of colonial space to two distinct nation states based on religious identity. Arguably, the narrative of this migration were not homogeneous in nature. The inherent variation in gender, caste, class had occasioned diverse experiences of partition for each person who migrated across the border to find the new homeland. The relatively affluent migrant population settled in the residential areas with proper housing and adequate facilities, whereas the socioeconomically deprived sections settled in tents, camps erected in different parts of the cities. Now, there were spatially variant pattern of migration, such as those were of continuous mobility that was happening in eastern Pakistan, which later became basically Bangladesh, to what has been called, which is now called as West Bengal in various parts. So both the countries, that is in the context of India and Pakistan, what we see is even prior to the formation of 71 was there were various kinds of camps that emerged. There were transit camp, relief camp that were constituted in order to house people who were basically moving in and out. So what we see is there were three kinds of categories of refugee camp. There were transit or relief camp, colony camp or worksite camp, and the third one is a permanent liability camp. The historiography of partition on either side of the border have showcased that the narrative of a refugee life in camp at various places, such as those in Kingsway camp, which is located in certain parts of Pakistan, as has been discussed by Kaur, and Purana Killa, which is located again in Delhi, but now at that point it was suggested so. So basically similar accounts of refugee experience can be seen in various other write-ups where it was presumed that those who were coming across the border would need a temporary place to stay. Now this temporality or the idea that they needed to house for a temporary span of time actually altered the mapping of the city, and this led to the creation of permanent colonies. Now moving into what we call the exceptionality of camps in South Asia. Refugee camps spatially materializes two concepts at its core: segregation and exclusionary protection. The makeshift construct of tents and shelters and camps are a reflection of the ambiguously transient nature for which the state has ideally conceived it, a space that permanently segregates and temporarily protects the excluded. The space of exception constituted by the camp defies the binary of inclusion and exclusion to which a citizen and a non-citizen respectively are subjected to. Therefore, the exceptionality of the camp is that the bare life of refugee is included solely through exclusion, as suggested by Agamben. In a nation-state global order arbitrated through borders and territory, camp excludes the refugee by admitting him into a space that he occupies. By first segregating and later confining the outcasts of the body politic to a demarcated space, the camp emerges as a zone in a state of suspension. It is at once both inside the ambit of the normal spatial organization of the nation state, and yet the person is residing outside it. Being physically located within the border of the state, camp is the inside. But by challenging the hyphenation between the territory of the state and population it embodies, refugee camp fall outside the normal spatial organization of the state. Hence, based on Agamben's conceptualization, camp can be seen as a space of exception that shelters a bare life. As individuals who have been deprived of political status, the refugee embody the status of bare life. Camp does manifest as an extraterritorial zone of exception where the sovereign decision to suspend the law of the land that accounts to the exclusion of inhibiting vulnerable population. Now, essentially, the refugee camps in South Asia conjures a specific pattern of exception within the discourse of refugee camp that are overtly generalized as spaces of exception. This particular exceptionality is brought about by the inhabitants of the camp developing a sense of belonging to the host society that at once problematizes both the space of exception in the camp and the bare life of refugee it shelters. The exceptionality is equally conditioned by two aspects: blurred cultural boundaries in South Asia and the absence of any legal framework in the whole subcontinent to guarantee the ambit of refugee protection. The functionalities of segregation and protection of refugee camp need to be contextualized in an aforementioned specific exceptionality that is prevalent in South Asia. The notion of protection has always been inherent in the practice of hospitality prevalent in the subcontinent. Yet the protection accorded in the earlier times and the current protection habituated by the performative practice of hospitality both are not dependent on the prerequisite of a law. Then delineating protection to those who are demarcated as others within the confinement of camp can be seen as a colonial legacy of a camp. This colonial legacy was being adopted, perpetuated by the post-colonial nation state in its attempt to institutionalize protection in accordance with the utopia of homogeneous nation. This brings in perspective the need to see exceptionality of the camp refugees developing a sense of belonging to the host state with reference to the functionality of segregation brought about by the camp. Refugee camps in South Asia characterize fulfilling the requirement of unmixing of the refugee with that of the host population. These refugees are organically mixed with the host society more often than those of the shared sense of belonging that they nurture, emanating from the common markers of identity such as language, religion, or culture. This makes it necessary to undertake a closer inspection of the idea of space of the refugee camp so as to locate the exceptionality within South Asia. The space of camp signifies many aspects, that is socio-political speciality, the configuration of power ensemblage it embodies, or even simply the structural design. But the ambiguous spatial and temporal functionality of camp specifically indicates the instrumentality of camp as a finite space that caters to the mass accommodation of the refugee over an extended period of time. The confines of the interpretational sovereignty make it a tedious task to define camp from the ambit of refugee accommodation. More than often, such definition that tag and characterizes such spaces are determined by political, administrative, and organizational disposition of the entities that govern them. Even then, the conceptualization of refugee camps as spaces of refugee accommodation, as argued by Harold Bourne Marx and others, can be seen through the lens of scholarly postulation that indeed these are essentially where one can say null spaces, or the Foucauldian notion of heterotopia as has been discussed. Now, the space of refugee camp being central to its speciality, we need to engage with diverse body of work of literature. I will not engage with it too much, but just to give you a sense of it, Foucault refers to these counterposing spaces of heterotopia that often reflect, contest, and invert the normalized space that we occupy. They construe illusory spaces that in turn expose the reality of messy, ill-constructed, jumbled material spaces that we inhabit. As sites of alternate ordering, where distinct approaches of control and freedom are envisaged, heterotopia molds the collective spaces we occupy as essentially different from the space that encircles us. For the refugee, camp is internalized as spatially bounded manifestation of repressive life in exile. But this internalization or speciality of camp is done through the reference of the place of origin of refugees. They navigate their everyday life in camp within the confines of order and control administered by the camp authorities, yet habituated by the limited care and conditioned protection from the humanitarian aid organization. Caught between the contentious spectrum of control, order, protection, refugees juxtaposes his space of exile life in camp with his space of homeland. The observation of the heterotopic space as being as a zone that ascertains its differences through underscoring the unity that encloses it, it becomes pertinent in the context of porous border that exists within South Asia to make a very pertinent argument. The refugee camp that shelter these forced migrants become the heterotopic space that mirrors the utopia of host society that surrounds us. The attempt to carve culturally homogeneous states created tangible friction that in turn caused separatist movement, minority persecution, and explicit state-orchestrated violence that were carried forward, especially in different parts of South Asia. This created condition for the forced migration of these vulnerable population, in turn creating a refugee influx to the neighboring countries. So the notion of homogeneous state building caused the host states to segregate the refugee from its population. By demarcating the refugee camp to the outskirts, the state carves an intangible boundary of segregation and separation within the tangible borders. The contouring of the undesirable refugee of a specific identity to the heterotopia of the camp thus resonates a utopia of homogeneous society that the state desires to create. Heterotopia of camp thus permits us to create an illusory mirror that affects the otherness vis-a-vis the us that resides in the utopia. As argued by Agia, even the otherness constructed is one without substance in the image of the non-existent, inaccessible thought of utopia, end of quote. So in perpetuating, what we actually we can see is there's a sense of exclusion that is being perpetuated over a period of time. Now, what is essentially suggested here is that in perpetuating the logic of exclusion, refugee camps can be compared to the conceptualization of non-place, so much so that the non-place territorialization of the biopolitic operative of camp via the exclusive entrance and exit. So in other words, the camp in South Asia does not differ so much, but it has a very inherent post-colonial understanding. Now, the post-colonial nation state essentially attempted to kind of repackage the whole understanding of segregation, confinement in a very which was prevalent within the colonial context. So what we have to say towards the end is that while discussing the discourse on forced migration, it is impossible to overlook the centrality of refugee camp as a spatial site that shelters the undesirable. This is even more pertinent in the context of South Asia, where the shared post-colonial history of the countries has conjured a distinct socio-cultural milieu in which the forced migration has been analyzed. Causative analysis of forced migration in South Asia, factors such as natural disaster, climate change, so on and so forth, has had an impact on the post-colonial state building that attempts to carve out a sort of a homogeneous population. Despite of not being the part of 1951 Refugee Convention or not having a concerted regional framework for refugee protection, countries such as India let the vulnerable migrants enter the territory. The tacit consent for admission and the basic protection offered to the refugees on entering the borders is based on a performative practice of hospitality grounded on the principle of humanitarianism. Historiography in the earlier what we were attempting to do, especially the trying to understand the colonial practice of segregation and then demarcating it wherein the vulnerables were segregated and left, there seems to be a sense of continuity in the post-colonial structure. The camps in South Asia exhibit a situation of exception within the space of exception that camps are generally tethered to. The fuzzy cultural boundaries that are not analogous to the borders established by the modern nation state of South Asia occasion the emergence of common sense of belonging among the people. In the absence of legal framework for refugee protection, the exceptionality of refugee camp in South Asia is constituted by this belonging, where the refugee develops a sense of affinity towards a host society. These camps, by virtue of the attribute of this culture or shared ethnicity, culture, language, or whatever you might say in the context of religion, host society contests this prevalence within the camp through the idea of non-space. Now, there are hence indicative of the heterotopias that in turn reflects the utopia of the homogeneous society that the nation state created or desired to create through the post-colonial state building in South Asia. The permanent exclusion of refugees in camps served as an effective instrument for post-colonial nation state to enforce segregated protection. The lack of sustainable political solution and concerted refugee protection framework precludes the successful forms of understanding also. So as opined by Gier, it is necessary to acknowledge that camps to be occupying the centrality of the margin in the context of forced migration generally and more specifically so in South Asia. The exceptionality of the sense of belonging among the South Asian camps of refugees cannot be overlooked because of the density of the blanket space of exception that we are usually seem to be typecast to. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't gone beyond my time limit.
What's capacity?
Thank you so much, Nasreen. I wasn't sure if my hand, were you able to see the signals on the screen? I know you were concentrating on your presentation, but I think maybe you were just the timing was just right, so no problem. But I don't think maybe you didn't see my thumb up because it shows up somewhere else on the screen. Okay, well, thank you so much. A very rich presentation. I have a lot of notes and a few questions for after, but I think So for those of you who are here, if you could hold your comments and questions, that gives us a lot to think about and many ideas to pick up on. I think we'll move to Nicolas Parent. And Nicolas, are you able to turn your camera on now?
Yeah, camera's on.
Okay. Do you have a presentation that you're going to be sharing with us, or?
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Okay, and maybe if you could just say a few things about yourself and where you're calling us from. I'll turn my camera off now.
Sure. Just before you go, do you see my presentation?
Yes, it looks great. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to attend this session. So my name is Nick Parent. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography, McGill University. Currently calling in from Kigali, doing some field work. Took quite some time to get over here, as you can imagine, with all of the COVID restrictions and what have you. So glad to be here. Glad that I held on to the fieldwork component. So the title of my presentation is Mutual Aid Amongst Refugees, Organized Abandonment and Anarchic Places. So for my 15 minutes, 15 to 20, probably more like 15, I want to talk about spaces where mutual aid and cooperation are flourishing. So contrary to the long-standing tropes, that figure the state and market capitalism as emboldening and omniscient, I've come across a different story in some of the places where refugees live. So in these places that I'll be discussing today, the state's central role in and responsibility in creating conditions of uncertainty, marginalization, and informality is well known. And these are the contexts of Turkey and Peru. Through repetitive experiences of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore would call organized state abandonment, refugees know not to trust the state and in fact find ways to go beyond it. Okay. Oh, there we go. Here we are. Okay, sorry about that. So I want to preface all of this because I understand that many equate anarchism with chaos and disorder, but this is very much a false understanding of an otherwise long-standing philosophical tradition and even longer-standing mode of social organization. So as Kropotkin observes, we have, quote, come to believe that there is nothing outside the government and the world of statesmen. So I think a lot of social scientists are quite aware of this, and there are some efforts to subverting this, and one of those is to think about methodological nationalism and how we sort of frame research around these national containers and state-centered containers. But ultimately, it is radical and critical scholars who are really taking it upon themselves to look beyond the state. I would ask those that are here on this call here that to sort of try to put that sort of hat on for just a moment. So in the cases I'll present here, my fieldwork exploring refugees' experience of exile led me to believe that they were in a situation of what's called organized abandonment. I don't know if there's any geographers out there, but let's just clarify some of those terms. So organized abandonment was advanced by Ruth Wilson Gilmore in her famous book, Golden Gulag. And it essentially means where a state in crisis systematically responds to its surplus of labor by directing vulnerable, poor, and racialized persons towards carceral solution. Now, I also think it's important to define what I mean, or what in this case Gilmore means, as the carceral, right? So the carceral is not just penitentiaries, right? So if we think of Foucault, but also other geographers such as Moran, it manifests itself through other disciplinary tactics, surveillance, segregation, containment, and boundary making. Okay, so it's not just about being in an enclosed space like a penitentiary, a prison, or even a refugee camp. So let's go to Bazmane, a sub-district of the Aegean city of Izmir in Turkey. So during my ethnographic work over the span of 18 months, I came to know an incredible group of a dozen or so Syrian women. When I first met them in 2015, this group was composed of just 3. They met at least once a week to discuss the hardship they endured. They bonded through their experience of displacement and deterritorialization as mothers and as widows. In asking how the group started, I was told that depression and lack of access to psychological services all combined to sow the seeds of this community. As the group grew larger, new members brought new skills. Children weren't being admitted to public schools, even so when the government made a public statement reminding institutions that it was their legal obligation to do so. Entry barriers were constantly erected, and instead of waiting, a former Syrian teacher started to offer alternative education and skills-based unschooling to children. She mentored other women, teaching them approaches to teaching and learning. Children were learning Arabic, something they would not at a Turkish public school. And with children busy and off the streets, their mothers were able to pursue other goals beyond child rearing, some for subsistence, others for creativity and self-fulfillment. In the case of infants, mothers would care for others' children as if they were their own, sometimes for time alone, rest, or again to pursue other goals. These women had developed a cooperative system of mutual care. I was told that deep connectivity was gained through milk kinship, where the children were bestowed upon them an extended family through this cooperation, relationships that would likely span temporalities. And while milk kinship is indeed nothing new, and particularly so in the Arab world, the implications for marriage and child rearing were somewhat waived in the name of cooperation. Excuse me. Cooking was also an important activity for this group of women. Some of the goods produced were sold affordably or sometimes bartered. Food was often gifted to neighbors and beyond, and particularly to widows, single mothers, or the elderly. Through this, women joined the community over time. And so it did feel like there was mobilization through community outreach beyond the core group. So here's here's a quote from one of the women that I met during my time here. So we have formed a community. Sorry, I can't really see because of this. We need each other because we experience different forms of suffering. Some of us have lost their husband or a child or parent. The chance of returning to our former home is increasingly low. That compounds our suffering because our futures look troubled. The situation here in Turkey isn't ideal. We are supposed to have the rights, but the government, hospitals, and schools, they don't deliver on this. It's the difference between what should happen and what actually happens. Syrian women support each other in general. It's part of our cultural heritage. But the social conditions here, a total absence of state support, are pushing us to be more organized and strategic in how we support each other. Here's someone else. No one is doing anything for us here. They just let us in the country, and yes, I appreciate that, but you can't do that and then not take care of us. We are taking care of each other in our own way. That can be better because it gives us freedom to teach our kids the way we want to. We don't have to teach about Ataturk, and we can teach our own stories and language. It's a lot of work and it takes a lot of time, but it's also rewarding and it gives us a break from the pain. Now, the second case I'd like to present dates back to 2019, and this was during my time at the Universidad del Pacífico in Peru, where I was mostly working with Venezuelans. In Chorrillos, a group of Venezuelan musicians lived together in a relatively small home. 12 people lived here, and most arrived to Lima between 2015 and 2018. A period of large influx of migrants and refugees fleeing economic downturn and political persecution. There wasn't enough room for everyone to sleep here, but they had reconfigured the householding norms and developed a rotation system. While some musicians played in public areas during the day, the others slept. When night would fall, those that were sleeping would wake and do evening sets while the others rested. This home was vibrant, it was breathing life, and was inspiring thinking about their efficient use of space. Labor was combined with play and creativity. This group of Venezuelans played songs that subverted a social context of xenophobia, singing local and distinctly Andean and Peruvian songs, getting locals to dance, be cheerful, and say things like, "I really like how they're playing our music." Even though I never teased out their intention, there was something very pragmatic and genius about this. Daniel, can you please turn off your microphone? Thank you. When one group would stop playing, another would take over the instruments. It was not just the household that was shared, but the means and tools of production. If repairs were necessary, these costs were shared, as was the maintenance of the instruments. While I can't say they were overtly anti-capitalist, all funds gained through public gigging and busking was pooled. Periodic meetings would take place late at night after the hours of performance to discuss how these common financial resources would be spent on essentials, to save, or to send remittances to family members who remained in Venezuela. Here's a quote from someone that participated. "Different conditions have led to our mode of cohabitation. Yes, economic conditions have made this necessary, reinforced by political conditions that legitimize our class position. However, and most importantly, it is our shared cultural and social conditions that have made it functional. In some ways, the bad politics and economics we endure have pushed us to not only rely on, but develop our cultural and social resources." So in both cases, we see that the state has otherwise abandoned these refugees, perhaps not to the extent that they could have by, say, closing the border, but within the political borders of these countries of asylum, refugees are largely left to their own devices. And while rights are supposedly guaranteed, access is a constant issue. Refugees in these two cases have organized beyond the state, coalescing around horizontal and anti-authoritarian mutual aid practices. Mutual aid itself is the horizontal and free assembly of individuals working towards common physical, emotional, artistic, and/or intellectual goals, free from and sometimes in direct response to coercion and violence. It is a mode of social organization based on substantive economics generated through supportive practices of reciprocity, redistribution, householding, and gifting. To quote June and Lance, "It is to embrace the idea that we can cooperatively reason with one another and thereby instantiate our common inclination to build a society that benefits all without instituting any sort of hierarchy that functions to enforce such arrangements." And lastly, it is an idea that is based on an anti-Darwinist and anarchist presupposition that humans thrive and develop as a result of cooperation and sociability instead of competition and fighting essentially against each other for resources. So what I observed through this research is not necessarily a direct engagement with the politics of anarchism. Rather, refugees in these settings have engaged in a radical and anarchistic ethics of care, what Williams would call implicit anarchism. As Gibson contends, this is the difference between, quote, ideologically motivated card-carrying anarchists and anarchical forms of praxis. In another sense, Clark refers to this as pre-revolutionary practices of, quote, libertarian and communitarian social life in areas like production, consumption, and cooperative living that would prepare the way for a more thorough transformation of society, end quote. And so I think this sort of speaks to something powerful Enrico Malatesta once said, which is that, and I'm just going to focus on this, what's kind of bold in here, which is that before thinking of establishing an anarchist society within the world, we must think of remaking ourselves able to be living in anarchistic ways. Okay, so it's an issue of I mean, it's not Marxist, but Marx would call it class consciousness, but in Malatesta's assessment, this is sort of growing a consciousness of each individual member and their sort of responsibility towards each other in anti-authoritarian, non-hierarchical ways. So in terms of just to conclude here, in terms of what this research contributes to, is I think that in a way it provides a counter narrative to this idea that the state is emboldening. There's so many folks out there right now that are talking about how the state is ever present, and a part of that is extensive research on populism, which of course is important, but I think it's important to also zero in on the outliers and the other realities that exist on the ground with people. Ethnographic research obviously does that. It also responds to this call for the study of exilic spaces, because in these spaces, and especially in situations of exile, we can observe the absence of state and how people respond to that or build their own forms of organization. And lastly, in terms of strengthening our empirical observations of anarchist and anarchic ways of life and liberation from oppression and state violence, not anarchism and as something that is an ideal or necessarily this utopia that folks who are party to this idea are just idealists. No, these forms of sociability do exist very much so, as far as I'm concerned, in the material world. Thank you very much.
I am muted. I am no longer muted. Thank you so much, Nick, for that really interesting. And now I've got my video on. I don't know if you can see me. Very interesting presentation. And I have questions, and I don't want to miss a question about the drawings or the sketches, because I found that a very interesting element of your presentation. So I think we have Laxman here?
No.
Oh.
It doesn't look like he's here. I mean, he registered, I sent him the link, I sent him the reminder. I'm just, something must have happened. So
okay. So I think that okay, thanks, Michelle. I think that concludes our presentations. So I believe the recording can be turned off. And we can begin our questions and discussion. I don't know. I don't think I'm